The engines cut at 2147 hours, and in the sudden silence, Lieutenant Howard Preston could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. PT-137 drifted on black water under a moonless sky, her bow pointing north toward the slot between Kolombangara and New Georgia, where Japanese destroyers ran supplies every night. The air smelled of salt spray, diesel fumes, and the peculiar organic rot of tropical islands. Preston stood beside the helm, one hand resting on the plywood cockpit rail, feeling the gentle rock of the boat beneath his feet. 80 feet of mahogany and plywood, 4 torpedoes, 3 machine guns, and 12 men. That's all they were. A splinter compared to the steel destroyers they hunted, a mosquito preparing to bite an elephant. "Contact," the radar operator whispered from below. His name was Kowalski, a kid from Chicago who'd worked at a radio repair shop before the war and could coax signals from equipment that should have been dead. "Bearing 350, range 8 miles, multiple targets, high speed." Preston moved to the small radar scope, its green glow the only light in the darkened cockpit. The screen showed 3 distinct blips moving south in column formation. Fast, 30 knots or better. The Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers making their nightly run to deliver troops and supplies to garrisons the Americans were trying to starve out. The Japanese owned these waters at night. They had bigger guns, better optics, longer-range torpedoes. They were professionals who'd been fighting since 1937, while most of Preston's crew had been civilians a year ago. But the Japanese didn't have radar, not like the Americans did, and that made all the difference between being hunters and being blind men swinging in darkness. "Wake up the other boats," Preston said quietly. "Tell them we have company." PT-136 and PT-141 were somewhere out there in the darkness, engines off, drifting on the current, waiting. 3 boats against 3 destroyers. The math didn't favor the Americans, but math rarely did in this war. You fought with what you had and hoped that surprise, speed, and sheer balls would carry you through. The radio man, a lanky Georgian named Pierce, began tapping out the contact report in Morse code. Radio silence was paramount. Sound carried across water at night, and the last thing they needed was the Japanese hearing American voices on the radio frequencies. Everything was done in whispers, hand signals, and the soft clicks of equipment being readied for battle. Preston had been commanding PT-137 for 4 months, which made him a veteran in a service where boats routinely lasted 3 months before being sunk, run aground, or pounded apart by their own engines. He was 24 years old, looked 18, and had a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT that meant nothing when you were trying to fix a bulky engine while Japanese shells walked toward your position. His crew called him Skipper or Mr. Preston when regulations demanded it, but mostly they called him Prez and treated him like an older brother who happened to give orders. "Range 7 miles, Kowalski reported. "They're maintaining course and speed. Don't think they've seen us." "They haven't," Preston said with more confidence than he felt. "We're wood and plywood. Radar barely sees us. They're looking for steel ships, not matchsticks." Beside him, the executive officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Mike Hannon, grunted. He was 31, married with 2 kids, and had been a fishing boat captain off Cape Cod before the war. He knew boats the way some men knew women, intimately, instinctively, with a 6th sense for when something was wrong. He'd saved their lives twice by hearing an engine irregularity before it became catastrophic failure. "Gonna be close quarters," Hannon said, studying the radar scope. "They'll spot us when we make our run, maybe 1,000 yards out. That gives us maybe 30 seconds before they open up with everything. Then we better not miss." The torpedo tubes were already loaded, armed, ready to fire. Mark 8 torpedoes, 4 of them, each carrying 466 pounds of TNT and capable of breaking a destroyer's back if it hit in the right spot. But they were temperamental weapons, prone to running deep or failing to detonate or simply running in circles because the gyroscope malfunctioned. Preston had fired 14 torpedoes in combat over 4 months. 3 had hit. The others had vanished into darkness, their fate unknown and irrelevant. "Start engines," he ordered. "Dead slow. Let's get into position." The 3 Packard engines rumbled to life, their roar muffled by underwater exhausts that released bubbles instead of sound. Even so, the vibration travelled through the hull, through the water, announcing their presence to anyone listening. PT-137 began to move, her bow coming around to intercept course, her wake a faint phosphorescent trail in the black water. The 2 other boats matched her movement, forming a rough line 300 yards apart. The plan was simple, because simple plans were the only ones that worked at night when confusion and adrenaline turned everything into chaos. They'd run parallel to the Japanese column, get within 1,000 yards, fire all torpedoes, then turn and run at maximum speed while the destroyers tried to kill them. If they were lucky, 1 or 2 torpedoes would hit. If they were unlucky, 1 or 2 PT boats would go down. Preston watched the range close. 6 miles, 5 miles, 4 miles. The Japanese destroyers were invisible, just radar blips, and the knowledge that somewhere out there in the darkness were ships 10 times larger, faster, and more heavily armed than his little plywood boat. "Ready tubes 1 and 2, he called down to the torpedo room. "Ready tubes 3 and 4. "Ready all tubes," came the reply from below. The crew was at battle stations now, spread throughout the boat in positions they'd practiced 100 times. The gunners at the twin 50 caliber machine gun mount forward, the gunners at the 20 mm cannon aft, the enginemen below deck, hands on throttles, ready to pour maximum power through 3 engines that developed 4,500 horsepower combined, an absurd amount of power for an 80-foot boat, but you needed absurd power to push 50 tons of wood and weapons to 40 knots, 3 miles. The Japanese destroyers were close enough now that Preston could imagine he heard them, the throb of their engines, the hiss of water along their hulls. But he heard nothing except his own boat and the blood rushing in his ears. "Mr. Hannon, you have the con," he said. "I'm going forward to direct the torpedo attack." Hannon nodded and took position at the helm. Preston climbed down from the cockpit and made his way forward along the narrow deck, holding the rail because the boat was moving now at 20 knots and the smallest misstep would pitch him overboard. The forward gunners gave him room as he positioned himself at the bow, binoculars raised, searching the darkness. 2 miles. Still nothing visible. The ocean was a vast, empty blackness, the sky only slightly less black, the stars obscured by high clouds. The only reference point was the radar scope reading that Kowalski was calling up every 30 seconds, his voice calm and professional, despite what was coming. "Range 1,800 yards, bearing steady." "Speed up to 30 knots, Preston called back. "We need to get into firing position." The engines roared louder, the bow lifting as the boat climbed onto plane. Spray sheeted back from the bow wave, soaking Preston's khakis, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on that empty horizon, where death was racing toward them, at a combined closing speed of over 60 knots. At 1,200 yards he saw them, 3 dark shapes emerging from the darkness, like surfacing whales. Destroyers. Fubuki class, if he wasn't mistaken, 2,000 tons each, bristling with guns and torpedo tubes of their own. Beautiful ships in their way, graceful and deadly, crewed by men who'd been fighting this war since China and knew their business. "Target acquired," he shouted. "Stand by for torpedo launch." The Japanese saw them in the same moment. Searchlights stabbed across the water, brilliant white beams that caught PT-137 like a moth in lamplight. Preston's night vision vanished instantly, the world becoming nothing but blinding glare, and the red after-images burned into his retinas. "Fire 1! Fire 2! He yelled, not waiting for perfect alignment, knowing they had perhaps 10 seconds before the destroyers opened fire. The first torpedo launched with a compressed air whoosh, the second 3 seconds later. The boat lurched slightly as 3,000 pounds of torpedo left the tubes. Preston didn't watch them go. He was already scrambling back toward the cockpit, yelling, "Fire 3! Fire 4!" as he ran. The searchlights followed him, and then the guns opened up. The sound was tremendous, a tearing, ripping roar as 5-inch guns and 25mm automatic cannons filled the air with steel. Water erupted in massive geysers around PT-137, some close enough that the spray drenched the entire boat. A shell struck the bow, tearing a jagged hole in the plywood but passing clean through without detonating. Another shell screamed overhead so close Preston felt the shock wave, then exploded behind them in a fountain of white water. "Hard right rudder!" Hannon was screaming. "All engines full! Get us out of here!" The boat heeled violently as Hannon threw her into a high-speed turn, the engines shrieking, throwing spray higher than the radio mast. The searchlights lost them for a moment, sweeping back and forth, searching. Preston reached the cockpit and grabbed the rail as the boat straightened out on her new course, running flat out now, the speedometer showing 42 knots, the hull pounding across wave tops with impacts that shook every timber. Behind them, 2 massive explosions lit the night sky. Orange flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. One of the destroyers had been hit. Maybe 2 hits, maybe just one massive one. Impossible to tell in the chaos. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off. The fireball illuminated the entire scene like daylight, the burning destroyer listing heavily to port, her midships section torn open, her bow and stern already starting to separate. The other 2 destroyers were turning toward the PT boats, their guns tracking, searchlights sweeping. "PT-141 is hit," Pierce yelled from the radio station. "She's dead in the water." Preston looked back and saw PT-141 caught in multiple searchlight beams, flames spreading from her stern where a shell had struck the fuel tanks. Men were jumping overboard as fire consumed the plywood hull. The Japanese destroyers were closing in for the kill, their guns hammering the crippled boat to splinters. "We have to go back," Preston said. "They'll kill us," Hannon replied, his voice flat. He wasn't arguing, just stating fact. "I know. Do it anyway." Hannon turned the boat without hesitation, bringing her around in a wide arc that kept them in darkness while the Japanese were focused on PT-141. The maneuver took 90 seconds during which Preston watched men die in burning water while their boat disintegrated under sustained fire. By the time PT-137 reached the scene, PT-141 was gone, just burning oil and debris and men swimming in darkness. "Get them aboard," Preston ordered. "Fast as you can." The crew threw lines, hauled survivors from the water, pulled them over the rail with desperate strength. Some were burned, some were wounded. One was missing an arm below the elbow, the stump wrapped in someone's shirt as a makeshift tourniquet. They pulled aboard 8 men before the searchlights found them again, and Preston had no choice but to run, leaving 4 more swimming in the darkness, because staying meant dying uselessly. The Japanese didn't pursue. They had their own problems. The destroyer that had been hit was sinking rapidly now, her bow pointing skyward, men sliding off her deck into the water. The other 2 destroyers were circling, picking up survivors, launching lifeboats, focused on rescue rather than revenge. PT-137 ran south at maximum speed, her engines screaming, her hull shuddering with each wave impact. The wounded were laid out in the small cabin below decks, where the boat's pharmacist mate, a kid from Nebraska who'd taken a 6-week medical course, tried to stabilize them with morphine and pressure bandages and prayer. One man died while they worked on him, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds that had severed his femoral artery. They wrapped him in canvas and secured his body to the deck, because there was nowhere else to put him. The adrenaline faded slowly, replaced by exhaustion, and the trembling aftermath of terror survived. Preston stood at the helm, maintaining course, watching the radar scope show empty ocean ahead. Behind them, the fires were dying. The wounded destroyer had sunk. The battle was over, and in the cold arithmetic of war, they'd won. 1 enemy ship destroyed in exchange for 1 PT boat lost, 8 men saved, versus 4 dead and 4 missing, presumed drowned. But victory felt hollow when you'd watched friends burn. They reached base at Rendover Harbour as dawn broke, the sky turning from black to grey to pale blue. The jungle-covered islands emerged from darkness like sleeping giants. The small harbour was crowded with PT boats, supply ships, ammunition barges, all the floating logistics that kept the Solomons campaign functioning. PT-137 limped to her dock, her crew exhausted, her hull peppered with shrapnel holes, her deck stained with blood. The squadron commander was waiting on the dock, Lieutenant Commander Harris, a pre-war regular Navy officer who ran the PT boat squadron with a mixture of iron discipline and fatherly concern. He watched them secure the lines, watched them carry off the wounded, watched them lift the canvas-wrapped body and place it gently on the dock beside 3 others from PT-141 that had been recovered by PT-136. Preston made his report standing on the dock, still dripping seawater, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke. We hit 1 destroyer, probably sank her, lost PT-141 and her crew, 8 survivors recovered. Estimate 4 enemy survivors we couldn't reach. Harris listened without interrupting, his face expressionless. When Preston finished, the commander said simply, "Good work. Get your boat repaired and rearmed. You patrol again tomorrow night." "Yes, sir." "And Preston?" Harris's voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry about Daniels and his crew. They were good men." "Yes, sir. They were." Preston walked back to his boat, climbed aboard, and began the routine of post-battle inspection. The engines needed maintenance, the hull needed patching, the weapons needed cleaning and reloading, the boat needed fuel, food, water, ammunition. There was always work, always preparation for the next patrol, because the Tokyo Express ran every night and there were never enough PT boats to stop them all. His crew worked without being told, moving through familiar tasks with weary efficiency. They'd lost friends but survived themselves, and survival created its own obligations. You kept going because stopping meant thinking too much about who was gone. You fixed what was broken and prepared for the next battle, because that's what you did in war. You fought, you survived, and you fought again. The pharmacist mate came up from below, his hands still bloody despite washing them. "Morrison didn't make it, sir. The one with the arm wound. He bled out about 20 minutes ago. Nothing I could do." "You did your best." "Wasn't enough." "It never is," Preston said quietly. "But you keep trying anyway." The work continued through the day. Carpenters from the base repair shop swarmed over PT-137, cutting away damaged plywood, fitting new sections, sealing seams with waterproof compound. Engine mechanics pulled valve covers, checked timing, replaced spark plugs worn by hard running. Ordnancemen brought fresh torpedoes, loaded them carefully into the tubes, armed the warheads. The boat slowly transformed from battle-damaged to combat-ready, the efficiency of military logistics turning chaos back into order. Preston tried to sleep in the afternoon but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the destroyer's searchlights, heard the roar of gunfire, watched PT-141 burning. The images were too fresh, too raw. So instead he sat on deck and wrote letters, one to Morrison's parents in Oklahoma, one to each of PT-141's crew members' families, trying to explain what had happened without explaining how terrifying it had been, trying to make their deaths sound meaningful when all death in war was ultimately meaningless. He was still writing when evening approached, and the other PT boat crews began preparing for night patrols. 3 boats tonight, PT-137, PT-136, and PT-159, a replacement boat that had arrived that afternoon with a green crew straight from training. They'd patrol the same area, hunt the same targets, take the same risks. Different night, same war. "You don't have to go," Hannon said, appearing beside Preston as the sun touched the horizon. "Harris would understand if you asked for a night off." "The war doesn't take nights off." "Yeah, but you could." Preston looked at his executive officer, this older man with a wife and kids waiting back home, this fisherman turned warrior who'd proven himself 100 times over. "Could you?" Hannon smiled tiredly. No, I couldn't." "Then we go." At 19:30 hours, PT-137 cast off her lines and motored slowly out of Rendover harbour with the 2 other boats following. The sun had set, leaving only purple twilight that faded to darkness as they cleared the harbour entrance and turned north. The engines settled into their familiar roar. The crew took their stations. The boat became a weapon again, prowling toward the slot where Japanese destroyers would soon appear. Preston stood at his position, one hand on the radar scope housing, feeling the vibration of engines through his feet. The fear was still there, waiting in his stomach like a coiled snake, but he'd learned to function through fear, to let training and duty override instinct's demand to run. His crew trusted him to bring them back alive. He trusted them to fight when the time came. It was a fragile web of mutual dependence, easily broken but remarkably strong when it held. "Contact," Kowalski reported at 22:45 hours. "Bearing 020, range 9 miles, multiple targets." And so it began again. The hunt, the approach, the brief, savage violence of torpedo attack, the desperate flight afterward. PT-137 survived that night, and the next night, and the night after that. She fought through July and into August, engaging Japanese destroyers and cruisers and supply barges, winning some battles and losing others, always returning to base a little more battered, her crew a little more exhausted. Other boats weren't as lucky. PT-164 struck a reef at high speed and tore her bottom out, sinking in minutes. PT-118 took a direct hit from a destroyer's 5-inch gun and exploded, killing all hands instantly. PT-172 simply disappeared one night and was never found, presumed sunk with no survivors, another ghost ship in a war full of them. Preston kept count of the boats lost, the men killed, the missions flown. The numbers accumulated like weights on his shoulders. By September, he'd been in combat for 6 months, which made him ancient by PT boat standards. Most commanders lasted 3 months before being rotated out or killed. He'd requested transfer twice and been denied both times because experienced PT boat commanders were rare and valuable commodities. "1 more month," Harris told him in late September. "Then you're going back to the States for instructor duty. You've earned it." 1 more month felt like forever. The mission came on October 3rd, delivered in a hastily called briefing at squadron headquarters. Intelligence had intercepted radio traffic indicating a major Japanese naval movement, cruisers and destroyers transporting troops for a counterattack against American positions on Vela La Vela. The PT boat squadron would patrol the Blackett Strait that night, prepared to intercept and engage targets of opportunity. 8 boats total, including PT-137. More firepower than usual, which suggested intelligence expected significant Japanese presence. Preston studied the charts during the briefing, noting the narrow confines of Blackett Strait, the small islands that would break up sight lines and radar coverage, the currents that could complicate torpedo runs. It was a good ambush site if you positioned correctly. It was also a killing ground if things went wrong. "Skipper's boat will be division leader," Harris announced, looking directly at Preston. "He's got the experience. The rest of you follow his lead." After the briefing, Preston found himself alone with Harris in the commander's small office. The older officer poured 2 fingers of bourbon into tin cups and handed one to Preston without asking if he wanted it. "To the boats we've lost," Harris said, raising his cup. "To the boats we've lost," Preston echoed, and they drank. Harris set down his cup and studied Preston with eyes that had seen too many young officers burn out or break down. "You going to make it through this month?" "Yes, sir." "You sure? Because I can pull you now if you need it. Put someone else in command of 137? Preston considered lying, then decided Harris deserved truth. "I'm tired, sir. Tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. And I'm scared every time we go out because I've seen too many boats go down. But my crew knows me, trusts me. If I bail now, right before I rotate out anyway, it'll feel like I abandoned them. So, yeah, I'll make it through the month, and then I'll go home and try to figure out how to sleep without dreaming about boats burning." Harris nodded slowly. "That's about the best I can hope for from any of you. Just bring yourself and as many of them back as you can." "I'll try, sir." "I know you will. That's why I'm sending you." PT-137 departed Rendover at 1845 hours as part of the 8-boat squadron. They ran in 2 divisions of 4 boats each, spread across a 2-mile front, racing north through gathering darkness toward Blackett Strait. The weather was building, wind picking up, waves growing, the smell of rain in the air. A storm was coming, which would make operations more difficult, but might also provide cover. They reached the patrol area at 20:30 hours and slowed to idle, engines barely turning, riding the increasingly rough seas. Rain began to fall at 2100 hours. Not a shower, but a tropical downpour that reduced visibility to near zero and turned the radar scope into a chaos of returns bouncing off raindrops. Preston hunched in the cockpit, watching water stream off the canvas cover, feeling the boat roll heavily in the growing swells. "This is going to make things interesting," Hannon commented. "That's one word for it." At 2147 hours the rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind choppy seas and a sky that was clearing from the west. Stars appeared in gaps between clouds. Visibility improved to perhaps 2 miles, enough to see other boats in the division, not enough to spot approaching enemies until they were dangerously close. "Contact," Kowalski reported at 22:03 hours. His voice was different, tighter, more urgent than the routine reports. "Multiple contacts, bearing 045, range 6 miles, speed 25 knots. Jesus, skipper, there's a lot of them." Preston moved to the radar scope and felt his stomach tighten. The screen showed not 3 or 4 blips, but at least 10, maybe more, moving in organized formation. This wasn't a normal Tokyo Express run. This was something bigger. "Get Harris on the radio," he ordered. "Tell him we have major contacts, probably an entire task force." While Pierce worked the radio, Preston watched the radar returns and tried to count vessels. He made it to 13 before losing track in the clutter. 13 Japanese warships against 8 PT boats. The math had gone from bad to impossible. Harris's response came 2 minutes later, crackly with static but clear enough. "All boats engage. Repeat, all boats engage. Disrupt the formation and fall back. Do not, repeat, do not attempt sustained combat. Hit and run." "Acknowledged," Preston replied, then switched to the division frequency. "All boats, this is Preston. We go in together, launch torpedoes from 1,000 yards, then break and scatter. Stay low, stay fast, and get the hell out. Good luck." The 8 PT boats formed into a rough line and accelerated toward the approaching Japanese formation. The range closed rapidly, 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. At 2 miles, the Japanese spotted them. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the darkness, catching first one PT boat and then another in brilliant illumination. The Japanese opened fire before the PT boats reached launch range. The night exploded into tracer fire. Streams of orange and red and white phosphorescence arcing across black water. Shells created massive geysers that glowed in the searchlight beams. A 5-inch round hit PT-159, the green-crewed boat, directly amidships. The explosion was tremendous, instantaneous, final. The boat vanished in a fireball, leaving only burning debris. "Launch torpedoes!" Preston shouted. "Launch all torpedoes now!" PT-137 fired her full spread. 4 torpedoes rippling out into the darkness, toward targets barely visible in the chaos of searchlights and gunfire. Around them, the other boats were doing the same, launching everything they had, turning the sea between the two forces into a killing ground of running torpedoes. Then they ran. PT-137 threw maximum power to her engines and turned hard right, heading for the darkness beyond the searchlight beams. Other boats scattered in different directions, breaking up the formation, making themselves harder targets. The Japanese gunfire tracked them, shells walking across the water, getting closer, then falling behind as speed and darkness provided escape. Behind them, explosions. Big ones. Multiple torpedoes hitting home. Preston risked a glance back and saw flames, at least 2 Japanese ships burning, maybe 3. But there was no time to count victories. The Japanese were launching torpedoes of their own, the deadly long-lance torpedoes that could run at 48 knots for 24 miles. The PT boats fled at maximum speed, zigzagging to avoid torpedoes they couldn't see, trusting to luck and prayer that death wouldn't find them. PT-136 wasn't lucky. A torpedo caught her in the turn, hitting directly beneath the cockpit. The explosion broke the boat in half, the two sections sinking in seconds. Preston saw men in the water, saw them waving, heard them screaming. He wanted to go back. Every instinct demanded he go back. But two Japanese destroyers were bearing down on that position, their searchlights sweeping, their guns ready. "Keep going," Hannon said quietly, reading Preston's mind. "We can't help them." Preston kept going. The running battle lasted another 20 minutes as the Japanese task force pressed south through Blackett Strait, and the surviving PT boats harried them from the flanks, firing machine guns and making high-speed passes that accomplished little except to distract and annoy. One more PT boat was lost, hit by gunfire and set ablaze, her crew abandoning ship and swimming for the nearest island. By the time the Japanese reached the southern exit of the strait and accelerated away, the PT boat squadron had been reduced from 8 boats to 5. But the Japanese had lost 4 ships, 3 destroyers and 1 light cruiser. They'd been delayed by 3 hours, and their troop reinforcement mission had been disrupted enough that the soldiers who did reach Vella La Vella arrived disorganized and short on supplies. In the cold arithmetic of naval warfare, it was a victory. It didn't feel like one. PT-137 returned to Rendover at 0430 hours, riding low in the water with minor damage and a crew so exhausted they could barely tie up the mooring lines. Preston made his report to Harris in 3 sentences. "We engaged. We lost 3 boats. Enemy lost at least 4 ships." Harris looked at him for a long moment, then said simply, "Go sleep. We'll debrief later." Preston stumbled to his bunk and lay down without undressing. Sleep came instantly, dreamless and total, the kind of sleep that was more like temporary death than rest. When he woke 12 hours later, the sun was setting again, and another night patrol was preparing to depart. He didn't go out that night. Harris had pulled him from the rotation, assigned him to shore duty for the next 2 weeks. PT-137 went out without him, commanded by Hannon with a temporary replacement XO. The boat returned safely. She went out again the next night, and the next, and the next. She survived October. In November, Preston received his orders transferring him back to the States for instructor duty at the PT Boat Training Center in Rhode Island. He departed Rendover on a transport plane, looking down as they climbed out at the small harbor full of PT boats, at the jungle-covered islands where he'd spent 6 months hunting and being hunted, at the water where so many boats and men had gone down. PT-137 survived another 2 months before being run aground on a reef during a storm in January 1944. Her crew survived. The boat was written off as unsalvageable, her engines and weapons stripped, her hull left to rot in the tropical sun. She'd participated in 47 combat patrols, engaged the enemy 23 times, and been credited with sinking or damaging 14 Japanese vessels. Her crew had rotated 3 times over her operational life. 60 men had served aboard her at one point or another. 8 had died. Preston spent the rest of the war teaching new PT boat officers at Melville, Rhode Island. He trained hundreds of young men, sent them off to fight in the Pacific and the Mediterranean and the English Channel. Some came back, many didn't. He tried to give them the skills they needed to survive, but he knew from experience that survival was as much luck as skill, and luck couldn't be taught. When the war ended in August 1945, Preston was 26 years old and felt 60. He stayed in the Navy for 2 more years, then resigned his commission and went back to MIT to finish his engineering degree. He married in 1948, had 3 children, worked as a naval architect designing small craft, and lived a quiet, ordinary life that bore no resemblance to those 6 months in 1943 when he'd hunted destroyers from a plywood boat. He never spoke about it except to other PT boat veterans, and even then only in fragments, incomplete sentences that hinted at experiences too complicated for words. What do you say about watching friends burn? About being terrified every night but going out anyway? About the strange exhilaration of surviving when you shouldn't have? There was no vocabulary for it, no framework that captured the complexity of fear and courage existing simultaneously, of killing and being killed becoming routine, of friendship forged in shared terror and broken by random death. In 1971, a documentary filmmaker tracked him down and asked to interview him about PT boats in World War II. Preston agreed reluctantly, sat in front of the camera, and tried to explain what it had been like. "We were kids playing a man's game," he said after a long pause. "We had boats that could barely survive a heavy sea, weapons that often didn't work, and orders to attack ships 10 times our size. It was terrifying. It was exciting. It was stupid. It was necessary. And somehow, despite all odds, we made it work. We sank ships. We disrupted supply lines. We bought time for the big ships to come. Was it worth it? I don't know. 18,000 men served in PT boats during the war. 500 died. We lost hundreds of boats. And in the end, we were just a footnote, a curiosity. The wooden boats that fought steel ships in the dark." The filmmaker asked if he had any regrets. Preston thought about PT-141 burning, about PT-136 broken in half, about PT-159 exploding, about the Japanese destroyer crews he'd killed, men who'd probably been ordinary sailors like his own crew, following orders, fighting for their country, about the 63 nights he'd gone out hunting, and the 8 times he'd almost not come back. "No regrets," he said finally. "We did what we had to do. Some of us survived. That's all you can ask for in war." He died in 1994, 73 years old, survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren who knew him as a gentle man who designed boats and told no war stories. They buried him with military honours at a small cemetery in Rhode Island. A handful of other PT boat veterans attended, old men now, their numbers thinning each year. At the graveside, one of them placed a small wooden model of PT-137 on the casket. It stayed there through the ceremony, through the 3-volley salute and the playing of taps, through the folding of the flag and the condolences. When they lowered the casket into the ground, the model went with it. Somewhere in the South Pacific, in water too deep for salvage, the real PT-137 rests on the bottom, her wood rotted away, her engines corroded into unrecognizable metal, her torpedoes long since degraded to nothing. Fish swim through where her cockpit used to be. Coral grows on what remains of her hull. The ocean has claimed her completely, erasing the evidence that she ever existed. But the men who sailed on her, who fought from her deck, who survived because she kept them afloat, they remember. And their children remember the stories they told, or didn't tell. And somewhere in archives and old photographs and fading documents, the record remains of what the PT boats did in the dark waters of the Pacific, how they fought against overwhelming odds, how they turned plywood and speed and courage into a weapon that helped turn the tide of war. The ocean keeps such memories. It always has. And in its depths, among the wrecks of boats and ships and men who went down fighting, the truth waits for anyone brave enough to search for it, that wars are won not just by battleships and carriers and overwhelming force, but by small boats and small men who refused to run when running was the only sane option.